Thank you so much for joining us today here on Law for the People, where we come to you every Friday from 1 to 3. Please always just jump on Fridays from 1 to 3. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a couple of wonderful guests today. Our first is Mr. Dustin Marshall. He's going to be joining us and talking about his run for trustee for the Dallas Independent School District in District 2. Now, why don't you introduce yourself to the folks there, Dustin?
Yeah, hi. As you said, I'm Dustin Marshall, and I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today and having me on the show.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm a Dallas native. Grew up in kind of the western edge of Lake Highlands and off Forest and Greenville for your listeners that are familiar with the area. Grew up in a poor single-parent household. Was kind of a college accident baby, I guess.
Yeah.
And, was raised primarily by my mom and my grandmother.
Okay. Let's get into your story and talk a little bit about you. Before we do that, let's kind of give the listeners a sense of what it is you're kind of running for.
Sure.
We've got listeners from really all over the world. Some folks, listening in from other countries. Yeah. I'm not sure, how many are doing that, but I know we have them because I see the analytics and see how that all plays itself out. But we've got folks who may be listening in specifically for this race. So let's talk a little bit about what DISD is. And the trustees that are involved, the numbers, and kind of what it is you're specifically running for. What does that look like, Dustin?
Sure. So the Dallas Independent School District is one of the larger urban school districts in the country. It's got about 228 schools with roughly 160,000 kids. It's run by a 9-member board of trustees that are elected in single-member districts.
Okay.
So the Dallas Independent School District transcends the city of Dallas and goes much broader than just the city limits, all the way down to Seagoville down in the southeast, all the way up to Addison in the northwest. And so that territory is divided into 9 roughly equal population groups. And each one of those 9 areas has a single member who is elected to the Board of Trustees. Once you're on the board, you vote on all policy decisions. So the board manages the superintendent as well as a second minor employee, which is the board auditor. You set the vision, the policy for the district, you approve the budget, and then you manage the performance and hire and fire the superintendent.
Let's give people out there, the listeners, a sense of what the demographics look like, what DISD is kind of comprised of. So let me just read this off the DISD fact sheet. It looks like the bulk of the students in DISD, the ethnic breakdown is 70% Hispanic, almost 23% African American, about 5%, a little less than 5% are white, and about 1.3% are Asian, and then you've got about 4 or 5 other categories that are relatively small.
Sure. So
we really are looking at DISD as a whole, most likely, a good, 83% are faces of color. Individuals who are either African American or Hispanic. So how does that kind of break down in terms of the specific district that you're running for?
Yeah, so I'm running for the District 2 seat, and we refer to District 2 as kind of a donut shape around the park cities. So for your listeners that are familiar with Dallas, you've got Highland Park and University Park in the middle of the donut, which has its own school district. But then the area of Dallas surrounding those park cities in a circle includes Preston Hollow on the north, Bluffview, Briarwood, Devonshire, and Greenway Parks on the west, Oak Lawn and Turtle Creek on the south, and then East Dallas, the M Streets, and Lakewood all the way up to White Rock Lake on the east.
Okay.
So that's the geographic territory. From a demographic perspective, those are some of the wealthier areas of Dallas. Right. They also tend to be some of the whiter areas of Dallas, to be honest. From various reasons, Dallas's housing is pretty segregated, and so so you see demographics in District 2 that do not mimic the demographics that you just talked about.
Right.
You also see within the schools in District 2 that those same demographic breakdowns don't apply in many of the schools in District 2.
There's actually 3 high schools in your district. I think it was Woodrow,
Hillcrest, and North Dallas.
Okay, and a couple of those are relatively similar. Woodrow and Hillcrest, kind of.
That's right.
And then North Dallas is kind of an outlier with respect to the 3. Kind of give us an idea of what those are and how those feeder patterns look into those areas.
Yeah, so there's 15 schools in District 2. They feed primarily into those 3 high schools that you mentioned.
Right.
The majority of the Woodrow feeder, there's not perfect overlap between the feeder patterns into the high schools and the trustee districts.
Right.
And so In the Woodrow feeder pattern, this trustee seat controls most of those schools that feed into Woodrow. In the Hillcrest pattern, there's about half the schools that feed into Hillcrest are part of the District 2 trustee seat. And then at North Dallas, it's interesting that the majority of the schools that feed into North Dallas are actually not part of the District 2 seat. Demographically speaking, you see a lot more participation in the schools from the neighborhood in the Woodrow feeder pattern. There's some great schools there, Lakewood Elementary, Stonewall Jackson, some emerging great schools, Lee and Lipscomb. And then you've got a strong middle school and a strong high school in that pattern. And so a lot of folks move into the neighborhood just to take advantage of those schools because the schools are so good. Arguably those are some of the best schools in DISD. And then in the Hillcrest feeder pattern, you've got strong schools, but you have less neighborhood participation in those schools than you would in the Woodrow pattern. You see a lot of busing into those schools, and so the demographics of those schools tend to more closely mimic those of the district that you just outlined.
Right. I'm actually a member of District 2, so I'll be voting on the 18th. I'm going to wait until actual voting day. So I have a really vested interest in the outcome of this, and it's a runoff election. It's not actually the general election. So you're actually running against another individual in this race.
That's right. Yeah, we had a 4-way contest on the general election on May 7th.
Right.
And that unfortunately, just given the dynamics of a 4-way race, it's tough for any one person to get over 50% of the vote.
Right.
I got just under 44% of the vote and was the top vote getter, but couldn't get to the 50% mark. So the second place finisher and I are in a runoff on June 18th.
Okay.
And we're in the midst of early voting right now, which goes through next Tuesday.
Okay, Dustin. We've kind of given everyone listening in a sense of what it is you're kind of running for, trustee of DISD.
Yeah.
Kind of gave them a sense of what it looks like. Let's talk about you. Let's go back to your history.
Sure.
You mentioned that you grew up here in Dallas?
That's right. Yeah, I grew up, as I mentioned earlier, kind of on the edge of Lake Highlands. Was in Dallas my entire life through the age of 18, and then moved away for college, bounced around several different cities, and got back to Dallas about 5 years ago.
Yeah.
But growing up, as I mentioned, grew up in a poor single-parent household, was raised, kind of part-time by my mom and part-time by her mother, my maternal grandmother. Because when my mom would go to work, my grandmother would help with childcare duties, and so was raised by 2 strong women, and had an amazing opportunity to go to a great school. Went to the Green Hill School in Addison, and was there from 2nd grade all the way up through high school, and graduated there in 1996.
Yeah.
And then went on to college on the East Coast.
Now that's a tuition-based school.
Yep.
And how'd you guys, without having much, how'd you kind of pay for that?
Yeah, I had a sort of a family benefactor that helped cover the tuition, but didn't help from a day-to-day financial perspective.
Yeah.
And so, kind of grew up with, I guess, one foot in both worlds.
Right.
Was a very interesting experience.
Right.
At a young age, I realized that I was very, very lucky to be attending Green Hill because we wouldn't have been able to afford it otherwise.
Yeah.
And I was spending time with my buddies who, their parents had 10 and 15,000 square foot mansions.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, I needed to go home and have ramen noodles for dinner every night because they were 39 cents and we could afford that. And so it just, even as a, 8-year-old, I realized, how fortunate I was to be getting a great education. And I remember, reflecting on how I had other buddies that weren't there, that weren't getting great educations, and that I had kind of won the educational lottery, so to speak. And so it really kind of taught me the value of that great education.
Well, I tell you what, we went to, my mother sent us to a Catholic school, private school, growing up. And I remember invariably, I had 2 older brothers and a younger sister and a younger brother. And, every once in a while when tuition was due, they'd get over the intercom and they'd say, "Will the following people please come to the principal's office who have not paid their tuition?
Uh-oh.
Eric Cedillo." And then I'd go down to the office and be the only one there that was. So I kind of understand that. My mother understood the value, certainly, of education and doing that. And that's kind of what we were brought up into. But then, I went from there to North Dallas High School, one of the schools that's actually in your district, and it was just a different world. It was a different world in terms of the way in which they challenged us, which, quite honestly, at North Dallas wasn't much at all.
Sure.
and going to the University of Texas for me, I was relying on everything that I'd kind of learned in those formative years, between kindergarten and 8th grade. And that's something that I want to talk about in a little bit in terms of early childhood and some other things. But let's get back to you. I think that's a really interesting story. What did your mother do? How were you guys kind of getting by?
She had various different jobs while I was growing up. She worked for a while at CSX Railways.
Okay.
She did some admin jobs and had a few sales positions and just various different things. My mother's very bright and very strong, but didn't have a single career trajectory, I guess you would say, that let her kind of climb the corporate ladder.
Yeah, and you mentioned an earlier story. You're currently is it the president, CEO of your company?
I'm the CEO. Yeah,
CEO of your company. And you mentioned something about your grandmother getting that started.
Yeah.
I think it's a wonderful story. Why don't you share it with us?
Yeah, so the company is called Hazel's Hot Shot.
Okay.
We are an expedited freight and logistics company. Hazel was my grandmother, who I mentioned earlier, helped raise me. And Hot Shot is kind of a slang industry term for what we do, which is those kind of emergency deliveries. So we do a lot of time critical, industrial shipments where the speed of the delivery is more important than the price.
Okay.
And my grandmother got that business started back in the 70s. She actually started it the year I was born. And it was kind of a special story. She had divorced my grandfather, who had left her penniless, and she'd grown up on a farm in southeastern Oklahoma and grown up really in extreme poverty. She had 10 brothers and sisters, and most of them died of starvation as children. Wow. But she, on her 18th birthday, she had saved enough money by picking cotton to buy a bus ticket to Texas and escape, those impoverished conditions.
Do you know when about she was born? When?
She was, she was 84 when she passed, and that was recently, so she would have been born just
in the 20s.
Maybe 1929, 1930.
Okay. So living through some rough times in the 30s and maybe the Dust Bowl.
Kind of the Dust Bowl. Yeah, exactly. But she came to Texas, met my grandfather. They were married, had my mother, but ultimately he ended up divorcing her for a younger woman and left her penniless. And so she, by necessity, had to do something. And she had a couple of jobs in the freight business and learned the trade, and then decided that she was going to open her own company. And so she didn't have any money, but she scraped together loans from friends to buy a used 1-ton Silverado pickup truck.
Oh, wow.
And started thumbing through the phone book, calling companies and saying, "Hey, I've got a little delivery company, and if you need me to make deliveries for you, I'll do it." And then she'd hop in the truck herself and and drive it and come back and wait on the phone to ring, or seek out business, and then go jump back in the truck. And so she kind of ran that out of a small apartment where she lived, and it took many years for it to gain traction.
Right.
But she ultimately was successful in building up a business that we now have today. And so she ran it from 1976, 1977 all the way up to 2011, which is when I took it over. Excuse me. She in 2010, her health started failing, and at the time, my wife and I were living in Chicago, and we decided to move back down here to let her have some rest and relaxation and move into retirement. So
so you kind of took over in 2011.
Yeah, we took it over in 2011. The business had been frankly struggling a bit in the most recent years, just because as she aged and as her health kind of deteriorated, there was not as strong of a leader there, and so things started slipping, and so it was a challenge when I got here and to take that over from her. And she was, of course, the longtime founder, and and everybody knew her and loved her, and so there was a lot of difficult transitions there. But I'm proud to say that the teams have been able to triple the size of the business, and since 2011.
That's great.
We've increased profitability by about 1,000%. Added another 150 or so trucks. We've bought 4 of our competitors in the state of Texas to expand our geographic reach, and proud of the team and proud of the progress we've made. But it all sort of rests on the shoulders of my grandmother. Yeah,
well, it's wonderful, a wonderful story and a wonderful legacy that you have with respect to your grandmother. Let's talk about you after Green Hill. You finished up Green Hill, and where do you go? Where do you go off to school?
I went to the Wharton Business School at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Was there for 4 years. Got a business degree with concentrations or majors in finance, management strategy, and information technology management. With a minor in political science, and then moved to Boston for my first job out of college, which was as a management consultant for Bain & Company, which is a large international strategy firm. Worked there for a couple years, then moved on to another small consulting firm called Alliance Consulting, which is actually where I met my wife.
Okay.
We worked together very briefly there.
This was in Boston?
Yeah, still in Boston. We were there very briefly. Unfortunately, that firm had some financial difficulties and ended up laying off everybody at the firm. So it's kind of a funny story. I had been sort of courting my wife while we were working together.
You lost your job.
Well, not for that reason. But, I had been, flirting with her and trying to get her to go on a date with me, and she kept saying, "No, we work together, so that would be inappropriate."
That's right. She was working with you.
Yeah, and so she kept giving me that excuse over and over again, and then. This business had two big clients, which were Office Depot and Coca-Cola, which together I think accounted for probably 80 or 90% of the business. Yeah. And they lost both accounts in the same week. Yeah. And so they gathered all of us in a room at 4 o'clock on a Friday and told us we were all terminated. And so I went over to her desk at 4:30 and I said, "You are all out of excuses. Like, grab your coat, we're going to dinner."
That's all right.
So she said, "Okay," and I guess the rest, as they say, is history. So,
what'd you do? What'd you do after that? What did you? You've just met your professionally.
Well,
we took a couple future wife.
We took a couple months off, had some fun, and traveled a little bit before we started looking for work. And then ultimately, she got a job, which forced me to get back into the workforce. Yeah. And so I ended up accepting a position at Fidelity Investments, and was there for 2 years while we were dating. And then we got married in 2005. And pretty much immediately, right after getting married, we moved to Chicago for me to go to business school.
So from Boston to Chicago?
Yeah. We lived in the northern suburbs of Chicago in a town called Evanston, which is where Northwestern University is. Okay. So I went there for business school and got an MBA from Kellogg. And Denise, my wife, worked to help put me through school while I was taking the 2 years off for my studies. And then after that, we moved down into Chicago, down into Lincoln Park neighborhood, which is kind of right in the heart of the city. And I went back to work for Bain & Company, where I worked for another 4 or 5 years before my grandmother's health started failing. And we moved down here.
Kids? You guys have kids together?
Yeah, we have 4 children. Okay. Our oldest, Lily, is 8. Then we have a son, Jack, who's 6. Another daughter, Haley, who's 4, just turning 5. And Maddie is our youngest. She's 2. Okay.
Yeah. And you guys came in 2011 back to Dallas.
That's right. Yeah.
All right. And how long had you been gone from Dallas before you came back?
I left in 1996.
Okay. And where did you say your wife was from? Where was she originally
from? She grew
up
in northern New Jersey, right outside, literally just across the Georgia-Washington Bridge from Manhattan. So she's kind of right outside New York. She grew up. Most of her family is all from New England, and she grew up spending a lot of time in Maine, though. So she sort of considers herself a New Englander.
So how'd you talk her into coming to Dallas?
It was difficult. It was a tough transition for her, and
what does she think of the heat?
Yeah, well, that particular summer, the first summer we moved down here, was one of the worst summers in Dallas history. Yeah. I think that was that year that we had like 100 days of temperatures over 100. Yeah, and she was not at all happy. She's like, "What have you gotten me into here?" But, she knew that we needed to do it for family reasons and for the business reasons. And so she was a good sport about it. And it took a while, but now she's, acclimated and has a great group of friends and is very, happy here now.
That's great. Is she still working or?
No, she quit working after our second child. We actually both were consultants for different companies after we left that firm we shared in common. And, as you know, consultants typically or oftentimes are on traveling projects. Yeah. And so after our second child, she got staffed on a project in Budapest.
Oh, really?
So I was at home with, 2 kids, one of them being a newborn while I was traveling for my job. And we just had a tough conversation and said, one of us is going to have to quit, and whoever is going to work for the rest of their lives, the other one needs to quit.
Right.
And we decided that she'd become, sort of a stay-at-home mom.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back, Dustin. I really want to get into why you're running,
absolutely, great,
what that's all about, and what kind of background you have that would kind of get you involved in this whole process. And then we're going to talk about some substantive issues with DISD, what's happening. And so you guys, please return. We're going to be back in about 2 minutes. We're here with our special guest, Mr. Dustin Marshall. Thank you. Hey guys, thank you so much for rejoining us on Law for the People. We're coming at you every Friday from 1 to 3 Central Standard Time here on the Fishbowl Radio Network. We are here sitting talking with Mr. Dustin Marshall, who is, of course, running for trustee of District 2 in the Dallas Independent School District, and he's kind of given us a brief history about who he is. My next question, Dustin, is why you're running for trustee.
Yeah, sure. Well, we talked a little bit about my own background and my own personal experience, and I just had that experience kind of shaped me, I guess.
Yeah.
And, it taught me the value of a great education and what a great education and a great school can do to lift a kid up from humble beginnings, and and how many kids aren't getting that same opportunity.
Yeah.
And so I just from a young age, I recognized that and felt like I needed to help other kids find that same pathway to success. And so, when I first got out of college, I started volunteering every Saturday as a tutor in an organization in Boston called the Stepping Stone Foundation, and mentored a couple of kids, and then went on to work as a pro bono consultant to help open a school in Boston. It was a Cristo Rey school, which is a Catholic work study program. Right. We now have one in in Dallas, and there's actually several locations around the country, but at the time it was a relatively new concept. And so we worked on that, and then went on to help another school in Boston expand from an elementary school up through 8th grade. Went in Chicago, opened another school, and so have just been, kind of got the bug and have never looked back and been involved for the last 15 years.
Okay.
And so, here in Dallas, when I moved back about 5 years ago, immediately looked for ways to get involved in helping kids. Of course, I knew some folks from growing up here, and so I started having some coffee chats and asking people, how I should plug into the education work that was going on in DISD and in Dallas more broadly. And of course, one coffee chat would lead to another because somebody'd say, "Oh, you need to go talk to so-and-so."
Yeah.
And I followed up on all of those and went and talked to everybody that was suggested. And so within the first couple of months of being here, I'd had over 200 of these coffee chats, and people were suggesting different organizations I should get involved in. And when I followed up on those, I ended up joining several different nonprofit boards and doing more and more work, and got to know several trustees very closely, including the previous holder of this seat, Mike Morath, who's now the Texas Education Commissioner.
Yeah.
And Mike started talking to me about considering running if he ever quote unquote got hit by a bus.
Yeah.
And then I guess
he got hit by a bus.
I guess he sort of did get hit by a bus. And so when the opportunity presented itself, it to me it was the ultimate way to help a lot more kids. And, I kind of added up all the lives touched by the nonprofit work that I was doing, and I was proud of that work, but it was probably 15, 20,000 kids. And, and this is an opportunity to impact 160,000 souls. And I think if I can do it, then I should. Yeah,
I don't think we mentioned that either. The seat that you guys are running for is actually for the remainder of the...
Don't remind me.
Right. So what is that? How much more time is left?
It's a little under a year
outstanding
on Mr. Morath's term. And, so the winner of this election will need to run again.
I'm assuming you'd be running again if you got the seat.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But I'm hopeful that if I emerge from this election victorious, that maybe nobody would file to run again the next go round.
Yeah, well, good luck with that,
we'll see.
Dustin. We'll see. And they're 2-year terms?
3-year terms.
3-year terms. Okay,
terms,
so at least you'd be able to do the election and then have a few years to kind of take it easy.
Absolutely,
I would suppose. Give us an idea from your perspective what the trustees do. You mentioned there's 9 of them in DISD. And they're representative, of course, of the district as a whole, but then they're kind of looking out for their specific district. And as you mentioned earlier, District 2, the creation of it and what the demographics are, things of that nature. But what does a trustee do, in your opinion?
Well, it's a governance role, not a management role, which is first and foremost a very important distinction. The superintendent runs the school district. He's essentially, the analogy is the CEO of a business.
Right.
And the board of trustees is much like the board of directors of a business. So you're overseeing that CEO, in this case the superintendent. You're setting policy. You're implementing measurement to make sure that those policies are adhered to and that there's accountability at all levels.
Okay.
And you're hiring and firing the superintendent. But beyond that, you're not to be getting involved in day-to-day management issues, which is unfortunately something that often happens on the DISD board. And so, I think one thing I bring to the table in this election is a lot of board experience. I've served on 7 or 8 different nonprofit boards in the education space, which has taught me a lot about policy, but also taught me, how to behave as an effective board member. And so, you got to walk into it understanding that distinction between governance and management. And then there's also kind of an informal role to play of, district cheerleader and, kind of representative of the constituents and the children in District 2. But when you're on the board, you're voting on policies that affect every kid in DISD. So you can't just get so myopically focused on kids at 15 schools in District 2 that you're ignoring the broader kids.
Exactly. Let's you make a very important point in terms of that and who's there in terms of the superintendent, who's kind of running the day-to-day things. Here at DISD, we had a kind of a polarizing figure, and Mike Miles, our former superintendent, brought in a lot of policies that you either loved it or hated it, and there wasn't much in between. He's recently left. They brought back an old face, Dr. Hinojosa. What do you think about the job, one, that Miles was doing, and how Hinojosa has kind of continued with some of the policies that he had in place? Has he tweaked anything? What are your thoughts?
So I think any conversation about Mike Miles has to separate his policy proposals from his approach and his management style. I was a fan of many of the policies that he put forth and that were passed under his administration. But I think the guy was a bull in a china shop. I think he had very limited interest or skill in collaboration or consensus building or community outreach, and so the guy broke a lot of eggs to make an omelet and left a wake. We unfortunately lost a lot of good teachers during his administration because people weren't feeling valued and culture and morale went down. When Hinojosa stepped in, I credit him with doing an excellent job of sort of righting the ship, if you will, and he restored morale and culture, and he did it quickly and efficiently, and I doubt there's any other person on earth that could have done it as quickly and efficiently as he did, given his history here. And so I credit him for that. What I would be watching if I were to win the election with Dr. Hinojosa is just making sure that he implements the reforms that have passed with fidelity and continues to be willing to push educational outcomes forward for kids, even if it might not be always the most popular thing to do. Yeah,
you tell me if I'm wrong, but I was kind of in and out of the meetings, and we met with Miles every once in a while. And when we spoke individually, when we talked as a group, certainly understood what he was doing and what he was trying to achieve. I don't see much of a difference in terms of the day-to-day policy organization and structure from Miles to Hinojosa. Do you think most of the, because there's a lot, you're hearing a lot less about problematic policies and other things than you did when Miles was here. So that personality, Hinojosa kind of, same types of policies, haven't tweaked them all that much, but there doesn't seem to be as much rancor between the competing interests. Does that make sense, or is it has there been some changes that we're really not too aware of?
Oh, well, there's been some changes. I mean, Hinojosa has terminated the Destination 2020 plan, for instance, but the data wasn't showing that it was working. So I think that decision made sense. Yeah, but you're absolutely right for the most part. There hasn't been too much of a substantive change in the policy direction the district is headed in, but there's certainly been less negative media coverage and less sort of drama on the board. I think part of that is just due to him being a very charismatic and very politically adept leader, and he's also got much stronger relationships with the trustees, and as you know, there's some strong personalities on that board, and I think some of those strong personalities took issue with Mike Miles and feel much more comfortable with Dr. Hinojosa at the helm. Okay,
let's talk about one of those big policies, one that Miles kind of brought in and is continuing, and has been, I don't know if it's too controversial, but certainly some people like it, some people don't. TEI. Tell us a little bit about what that is, and would you tweak it? and again, this would be the superintendent's call, but backed by the trustees in terms of how he's doing. Tell us a little bit about what it is, how it's kind of currently implemented, and if you would want to have any changes to it.
Sure. So TEI stands for Teacher Excellence Initiative, which is essentially a teacher performance measurement, compensation, evaluation, and development tool. It's based on a lot of national research that was, the most recent study was done by the Gates Foundation that basically outlined how teacher effectiveness can and should be measured and rewarded.
Okay.
And so the easiest way to think about it is that each teacher is getting a scorecard, and that scorecard is made up of 3 component parts. 50% of the grade is based on in-classroom observation by the principal or other administrator. 35% of the grade is based on the test scores of the students within the purview of that teacher, and that component has 2 ways of measurement. One is the absolute test score. The other is the relative kind of longitudinal improvement in the test score with a group of students over time. So that's intended to recognize that some students are starting from a lower performance place, and so if a teacher successfully moves them up, then they should be rewarded for that, even if the absolute score is still relatively low.
Right.
And then the last component part, 15% of the grade, is based on student surveys. So we're essentially asking the students to assess their teachers. And oftentimes people kind of raise their eyebrows at that metric, but that's actually, ironically, the one that data shows is most correlated to the success of a teacher. And to me, it makes sense. If you reflect back on your own life, you probably know who your best teachers were, and it turns out that you knew it at the time too.
Yeah.
So I'm an advocate, as you can probably tell. I'm a supporter of TEI. I think it's one of the most revolutionary things that's happening anywhere in the country in education, reform and improvement. There's a couple of other cities around the country that have implemented a similar plan. The most notable example being Washington, D.C., where it has been wildly successful. We've had it in Dallas now for 1 year, and it's been very successful during that time period. 70% of teachers have received a raise under TEI. 40% of teachers have received a raise over $4,000, which on a teacher salary is a serious percentage increase. And we've seen some teachers that have left the district, but if you look at the performance bands of those teachers that have left, the vast majority of them were underperforming. And so, in my book, if there's teachers that aren't doing a good job of educating our students, then those teachers should either be coached up through better professional development, or they should go find another job. And so TEI is accomplishing that. And so I think philosophically it's a very important program. It's one that my opponent has been very vocal in her opposition to. I think it's in large part a key building block for the success of the direction that the district is headed in. Now, I think it needs some improvement and some changes. It's intended to be a development program in addition to a measurement and compensation program, and we aren't doing a very good job of the development piece. So when we recognize teachers that are sort of middle of the pack or bottom quartile, rather than terminating those teachers, we need to be doing a better job of coaching them up, and that area needs a lot of work.
What does that look like, Dustin, from your perspective?
Yeah, well, we used to have a professional development department that Mike Miles got rid of. I question the logic behind that decision. I think the intent was to move towards a more decentralized structure where we use these executive directors that are in charge of each feeder pattern. I do support the idea of the executive directors because I think it breaks up the district into smaller, more manageable pieces. But it does put a lot of responsibility on the principals and the executive directors to coach up those underperformers. And I think we may have we may have put too much burden on those principals and the executive directors to do that effectively without some central support.
Okay. A couple of the criticisms, we actually had your opponent on last week.
Sure.
I think her biggest criticism with respect to the student evaluations was tweaking it to the extent that some of the younger students may not have the ability to, basing what teachers' salaries might be on younger students who may not know the distinctions or differences in terms of the questions that are being asked. Do you think that's a valid argument? Do you think that's something that that we should be looking at in terms of tweaking it towards the younger students may not have as much of a say? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's certainly stories that you hear, and I've heard my opponent talk about, her child or another child that may be upset with a teacher and may, grade them more harshly on any given day since they were upset with the last grade that they got. But
Yeah.
and those stories are always going to exist, but when you look at the aggregate data that's sort of normalized for those one-off stories of something going wrong, when you sort of boil it up to a classroom level or a school level, the national research is very clear that this methodology works for students of all ages, and and the way that the questions are worded are age appropriate for the kids, where it's not like they're not asking, do you like Mrs. Smith? They're asking about, does she help you when you encounter difficulty in a certain situation, as an example. And so, so I think once you aggregate lots of students' input together, you end up directionally with, with a telling data point.
Okay. I think another criticism that she had with TEI in terms of its current form was the principal evaluations. Principals kind of popping in. What is the requirement, or what does it look like currently with principals
principals and the evaluators to make sure that they're doing an apples to comparison?
Right.
And I'm sure there's some improvement that we can do further in there. But there are quite a number of spot observations that are required. And
do you know how many there are? Or
I think it may be 8 to 10, but
Okay.
I'd have to double check to give you an exact number. But many of those observations are relatively short.
Okay.
And the idea is that if a teacher's having a bad moment on one of them, or not teaching the exact thing that they were scheduled to be teaching at the moment that the observer comes in, that in aggregate those, because that's going to happen to every teacher, right? So when you aggregate multiple spot observations across a given teacher, their score is fair relative to the other teachers that were evaluated in the same way.
What do you think about the weighting system? 50% of that part of it, the TEI, is weighted towards principal observations, or the observations that are...
Well, that's a very interesting question. One thing that Miles tried to do when working on TEI is hold a lot of focus groups with teachers and with administrators to get input on that percentage breakdown. The percentage breakdown that DISD ended up going with varied a little bit from what the Gates Foundation research actually advocated for was the ideal mix, and that the mix that we went more towards was based on teacher feedback. So we increased the subjective weighting of the principal evaluations to 50% of the grade based on teacher feedback.
Okay.
I think that was a good process to follow, and if that's what the majority of teachers think is fair, then I would support that, simply because it was the community's decision. If I were unilaterally making that decision, I probably would have gone with the weighting of the Gates Foundation research.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit, if we can, about testing. The testing in the schools. I know we hear a lot about it. There's a lot of criticism. Oh, there's too much testing. They're teaching for the test. They're not teaching for other things. It takes away, it detracts. What do you think about the current state of DISD? I know there's state mandated testing as well as DISD implemented testing. Give us an idea of what that is, and what your thoughts are with respect to that.
So I think of testing a bit like a pendulum. I think several years ago we were on one end of the pendulum, where we weren't doing sufficient testing to hold teachers or administrators accountable for the results of their kids, and we weren't able to identify particular developmental needs of students because we didn't have kind of a longitudinal test that said here's where they were and here's where they are, and so in that time period there wasn't enough tests. Now I think we've sort of swung the pendulum to the far other end where we're over testing, and I think it's particularly true of our younger students, where we're giving a test to a kindergartner, which to me doesn't make much sense.
Yeah.
But what I'd like to see happen is kind of move back towards the middle. I think it's irresponsible to sort of have a political narrative that all testing needs to go away, and that high stakes testing is bad, because there isn't really a replacement idea for that. And to me, accountability is critical, and if we need to do some tests in order to measure and distinguish our best teachers from teachers that shouldn't be in front of our kids, then I'm okay making the sacrifice of having some tests. I just think we need to be more thoughtful about how often we're doing it and make sure that the tests are good tests.
Yeah.
In DISD, we are forced by the state to comply with the state testing requirements, which is the STAR test.
Right.
The STAR test is not a good test. I mean, there are almost no school districts in the state that are doing well in the STAR test. Even very successful, high-performing, wealthy neighborhoods and suburbs don't do well in the STAR test. So I would encourage
Whose
that
responsibility is that to correct that test?
It's the State Board of Education that needs to weigh in on that. Hopefully our friend Mr. Morath can improve that infrastructure, and I think DISD can play a role in advocating and lobbying for those changes.
Do specific trustees, do you think they have an obligation, a right, an ability to do that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that having a sort of unified voice from the DISD board in Austin would be very powerful. I mean, we're the second largest school district in the state, and I think most of the Houston trustees would agree with Dallas that the STAR test is not a good one. And so I think if we were, unified, we could have a big voice.
Okay, Dustin, we've got about 1 minute before we have to go off air. Why don't you tell everybody kind of listening? We've just finished, or I think we're finishing up today, the early voting. Tell us when the election is and
Yeah, we haven't quite finished up early voting.
Okay.
It goes through this coming Tuesday, June 14th.
Tuesday 14th, okay.
So it's open today until 5 o'clock, this week, Saturday 8 to 5, Sunday 1 to 6, and then Monday and Tuesday from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Then the election day is on Saturday, June 18th.
Okay.
During the early voting period, you can vote at any early voting location. In District 2, the three ones that are open in the district are Our Redeemer Lutheran Church across from North Park, the Marsh Lane Baptist Church on Marsh and Royal, and then Samuel L. Grand Recreation Center. And then on election day, each person needs to vote at their own polling location, and they can find that location at dallascountyvotes.org.
Okay. I would encourage all you guys listening in to please go out there and vote. Very important election, very important for our children and their future. If you're in District 2 and listening in, please make sure that you let your voice be heard. Mr. Marshall, it's a real pleasure meeting you and talking to you again.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Get out there and vote. We're going to be heading into a break right now. We're going to come back with our next guest, Mr. Joey Alde, a former #1 amateur boxing champ, and he's making his pro debut this month here in Dallas. So please rejoin us in about 2 minutes. Thank you so much.